Our IT department gave us training on what to look for. We've gone through phishing testing. We've gotten better. These test emails look legit, but we figured out that if it is something promising a lot for nothing, we avoid them. But this email looked like it came from one of the guys I worked with. And it talked about facility kind of stuff. How was I to know?
I have been in the real estate industry for a little over 15 years now, operating everything within the finance of it, construction, facility management, and development. We are a real estate investment trust, or a REIT, that owns and operates buildings across North America. My main title is portfolio manager, so I oversee a piece or a section of this, if you would, of the portfolio that we have or we operate with across North America. So at some level, yes, the facilities rolls up underneath of me, and responsibility of that, whether it be budgetary or anything related to facilities, rolls up under me to some level. I would say generally nothing beyond typical pieces of cybersecurity that come along with packages that we buy from our vendors, whether it be the BAS, lighting controls, whatever comes standard from their offerings, McAfee, whatever it may be, installed on their systems. That's about the extent of it from an OT cybersecurity piece up to this point. I would say up to this point, it may have been a tertiary piece that we might have been tracking lightly. I would say, given everything that's happened and some of the more maybe recent news events that have occurred, I'd say that it has definitely been more of a priority, a topic of conversation, even at higher levels beyond me, entering in more of the executive or C-suite level conversations. So as we had talked about, we manage buildings, or portfolio of around 200 buildings across North America. The particular site that we'll be talking about today is a 20-story building with various tenants occupying the space across those different floors. And then from an unoccupied standpoint, it's typically unoccupied between the hours of 7 p.m. and 5 a.m. That is important as we'll get into the actual event and what transpired in the subsequent days of the actual event. It's an important note to take to understand when potential cybersecurity issues may occur, as opposed to an occupied time between, if it's 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning till 6 or 7 o'clock at night, when the building is typically staffed by FM or other vendors that might be performing work or maintenance. start from the beginning. So a day prior to the actual event, our building engineer checked his personal email on the BAS application server. And when he was doing that, he had actually received an email that appeared to be from a fellow engineer that he worked with in the building. The building engineer checked the email, thought it was a little unusual that his fellow employee or colleague had emailed his personal email, but nonetheless he opened up the email and there was a link embedded within the email. Nothing seemed overly suspicious given the content was something that would be not unusual for them to email back and forth or have conversations about. So anyway, he proceeded to click on the link and nothing happened. He thought maybe the link was just copied over that poorly, or it wasn't an active link, so it didn't work. And then not long after that, the building engineer talked to the other engineer that had sent him the email and let him know that hey. The link that you had sent me, it didn't take me anywhere. It didn't work. What was it all about? And the other engineer replied that he had not sent him an email, nor had he sent it to his personal email because he didn't know what it was. He only would ever communicate him via work email, which would typically be standard practice. And so none of these inconsistencies ever caused the engineer to necessarily notify anybody about what had gone on. However, they did have a little bit of the foresight to download a backup of the application server on an external hard drive just in case something was amiss. But all in all, the day ended without incident. And so the following day, actually about mid-morning, another engineer had to make a set point adjustment due to a hot cold call coming from our 10th floor tenant. And so the engineer went to the application server to make the adjustment, and he noticed that a window was open that he had never seen before. And the message within the window said, and I quote, "Your important files are encrypted. Many of your documents, photos, videos, databases, and other files are no longer accessible because they have been encrypted. You may be busy looking for a way to recover your files, but don't waste your time. No one can recover your files without our decryption service." In addition to this message that was left on the screen or in the window, there was instructions on how to recover and subsequently how to pay for that recovery. And then to add a little bit more drama to it, there was a countdown timer letting him know when all the files would be deleted or lost. Almost like something out of a movie, in my opinion. But nonetheless, that's what happened. The engineer that had clicked the link the day prior to this happened to be in the room at the same time and let the engineer who had initially tried to make this set point adjustment, let him know that they had done a backup of the application the day before, and that he should go ahead and call the vendor and have them reinstall the operating system and the application. So that's what the engineer did. The vendor was able to come and reinstall the operating system, install the application, and the files necessary to get the application up and running. Now, not long after the system was back up and running, there was some anomalies that occurred with some of the equipment in the central plant. For example, the variable frequency drives, or VFDs, seem to be running slightly faster and sometimes slightly slower. However, they settled out and the rest of the day was fine. Mechanical equipment can sometimes, depending on the age of it, can be a little finicky, so it didn't really give it a second thought. And then several days later, staff arrived, went about their day just as they normally would, and around mid-morning, there was kind of an indication that there might be some sort of problem. The engineer noticed that the central plant, the controllers, were offline completely. They also noticed that there was no alarm showing that the central plant was out, the controllers were offline. At a minimum, those, we would have seen an alarm within the front end stating that the controllers were offline. So that raised some alarms, and it was, obviously unnerving or a little unsettling. So they began to do an investigation of the plant and found that the chillers were just off completely, which again is pretty unusual in a 20-story building with roughly 95% occupancy. Chillers tend to have to be on in that type of setting. So upon further investigation, they found that several of the VFDs were also inoperable. The staff attempted to then restart the main chiller and were unable to. At that point, they tried one of our auxiliary chillers as well, tried to manually restart that one. That was unable to start as well. So they began investigating mechanically the cause, at which time they found that extensive damage was done to the pumps due to what we believe to be cavitation. At this point, there was no association between what was currently happening with the chillers being off and unable to restart, the plant controllers being offline, and the issues with the pumps and the cavitation. Between those things occurring and the ransomware attack that had happened the previous days before this. So, all said, the investigation kind of wraps up into what's going on. It's determined that several of the pumps were going to need to be replaced, and each of the chillers were going to need to be fully inspected to find out what was the extent of the damage within each of these chillers. The controls vendor was also contacted to investigate the system to check the application out and to get the controllers back online and determine why there were no alarms back at the front end to let us know what had happened. And so in doing all of that, the staff determined that not only did several of the pumps need to be replaced, but also the VFDs. They found that the VFDs appeared to have been running beyond their critical speed, and which was a little unusual. And while they were actually having this conversation, the vendor happened to be there with them and listening in and let our engineers know that the only way for something like this to have happened is if somebody had disabled the safety feature that would typically prevent something like that from happening. So when this information was brought to light, it really began to kind of change the thought process from a possible equipment failure, which, given the number of devices that were affected and the total extent of the damage, really was pretty improbable. And so it went from being an equipment failure to a possible hack of the system. And so at that point, the direction of the investigation took a turn, and it went from mechanically how did this happen to this is probably what happened, but how did it happen exactly? And so the first thought was that another unrelated hack had happened. But after conversations and further consideration, it seemed unlikely that this was a separate attack or hack, because lightning doesn't typically strike the same place twice. So the vendor went through the backup, or we asked the vendor to run through the backup that was made the day before the attack, and found that the infection occurred the day of the backup, and it most likely came from the email that the engineer clicked when he checked his email on the application server. Now, most of what is stated here is strictly speculative because there's no forensic data that we have right now. This is because the system had been reloaded and no logs were retained. So we were unable to see who and when accessed the system, and what was done is still unanswered to this date. As we kind of investigated all of these things, there was some high-level findings, or in some cases maybe lessons learned on some of these pieces. Some of those things were facility staff was sharing a single username password, so everybody was using that same username and password. The application server is located in the engineering office and is logged in 24/7. Mostly out of convenience, and that way they have the ability to access it whenever needed. In addition, the application server is used to check company email, personal email, social media, and browse just the general internet, which typically shouldn't be allowed regardless of what happened, but we now know what were some of the potential issues here. In addition to that, a single username and password is used by all the vendor technicians, not only for our sites, but any other customer sites that they have where they perform their services unrelated to our sites. It could be any other real estate site that they're performing work on. The vendor and the facility management staff have access to the system 24/7 using a public IP. Again, really out of convenience, but needs to be further investigated and understood. And finally, backups are not performed on a regular basis. Previous to the backup that was done at the beginning of this event, the last backup prior to that was 1 year before that. So a recent backup was performed a day prior to the attack, like I said, but beyond that, it had been a year. And so what we believe to have occurred in this event was the vendor found that a rat, or what's also known as a remote access Trojan, was also in the payload of the ransomware. Once that rat was embedded and the hacker or hackers planted the ransomware, it's most likely that a beacon went out and notified the hackers that the rat was installed. When the system was reloaded, the beacon notified the hackers that it was active again, and the hackers realized that they were not going to get paid, so let's cause some damage to the system instead. What ended up happening, or what we believe to have happened rather, is they remotely accessed the system and played with the VFDs. If you remember earlier in the story, I touched on the fact that the VFDs were ramping up and slowing down kind of periodically with no rhyme or reason necessarily. That we believe to have been the hackers testing the system and seeing what they could or could not do. And what they began to realize is that they should wait until the building was unoccupied. So going back to that earlier reference of the time frame of when the building was unoccupied between 7 p.m. and 5 a.m., that is an important time period because facility maintenance staff, vendors are not in the building during that time. So everything is not monitored. And access, for example, to the VFDs is via BACnet, which does not require a username or password. And so what the hackers, we believe, were able to then do was go in and disable the alarms. They hacked the VFDs, which is most likely what caused the cavitation, and the pumps were then subsequently destroyed. They were able to brick the central plant controllers. Again, similar to the VFDs, their access is via BACnet and does not require a username or password either. And then finally, just some of the results due to this event was some of the damage to the system included roughly half of the VFDs needed to be replaced. The chiller had to be dismantled somewhat for an inspection of damage to understand what was the full extent to be able to repair it. Several of the pumps had to be replaced due to the damage from the cavitation that we just talked about. The central plant controllers had to be replaced because the hacker rendered them unrecoverable. A new PC was also then for the application, had to be purchased to ensure that no residual infection was present. And because the backup was corrupted, the only backup, like I mentioned before, was a year old. The application host programming had to be redone. It was a course of a year. There had been renovations done, devices had been added, programming had been done within that time frame. So, there was still a lot of work that had to be done to get it back to where it was. So all told, this process, for the recovery of all of this, the entire process to fully recover was 92 days and thousands of man hours. In addition to having to, obviously buy hardware, software, pay for man hours to get this completed and recovered and back up. In addition to all that, we also had to then rent space cooling and heating units, module units, to ensure that tenant comfort was maintained throughout these 92 days. So that was an additional expense that we had to incur in order to just make sure that the tenants remained happy. There's also made potentially long-term effects, tenant satisfaction, tenant, almost quote-unquote safety. How do they feel having a building that has been hacked? If we're bringing in module units to heat and cool, questions are asked, people want to know what's going on. And we like to maintain our buildings at an occupancy as high as possible. And so these are things that run through our mind as we start moving forward beyond this incident.
We always thought that hackers targeted credit cards and healthcare. Why would they care about lights or HVAC or really anything that was in a building? We also felt like we did a good job of backing up what needed to be backed up. If something happened, we figured what we had would be fine. This hurt. We are still trying to figure out how much this really costs us. But we also took a pretty serious hit on our brand and the confidence our tenants had in us.